Hallo, hallo. Hører dere meg? Hei. Velkommen hit til Reitan og Reitan Kapital. Mitt navn er Håkon Kavli. Jeg er investeringsdirektør i Reitan Kapital, og det er min glede å ønske dere velkommen til vårt arrangement nå om geopolitisk usikkerhet i kapitalmarkedene. Vi i Reitan Kapital ser på oss selv som et lite Reitan-gruppens oljefond i miniatyr. Vår jobb er å ivareta og utvikle finansielle verdier for virksomheten og for fremtidige generasjoner av eiere, kjøpmenn, medarbeidere. Vi forvalter en global portefølje med rundt 12 000 ulike aksjer, mange flere obligasjoner i hele verden. Og sannsynligvis så er de fleste av dere her i salen også hjemme i samme situasjon, i den forstand at dere kanskje eier et indeksfond med aksjer over hele verden, eller har en pensjonsordning som dere skal leve av senere i livet. Det betyr at vi alle egentlig er direkte eller indirekte påvirket av alt som skjer i global geopolitikk, verdensøkonomien og i markedene. Da dukker det opp veldig komplekse, vanskelige spørsmål nå for tiden, og for å diskutere dette så har vi fått med oss en person, en ordstyrer, som kan dette temaet like godt som paneldeltakerne. Det er hele Norges USA-ekspert, forsker og kommentator, Sofie Høgestøl. Sofie er førsteamanuensis ved Universitetet i Oslo, veldig kjent som USA-kommentator på NRK og andre norske medier. Hun intervjuet nylig Barack Obama i Oslo Spektrum, og derfor tror jeg at Sofie ikke lar seg vippe av pinnen av dette ellers knallsterke panelet som skal opp på scenen etterpå. Så, hvor er ditt? Velkommen.
Tusen takk. Tusen takk for invitasjonen. Jeg vil bare understreke, jeg kan ikke finansmarkedene like godt som de som skal på scenen nå. Det er heldigvis ikke min jobb. Jeg heter da Sofie, og jeg er egentlig i mammaperm. Så da jeg ble ringt og spurt om å være med på dette, jeg sitter i hovedprogramkomiteen til Arendal, så jeg skulle selvfølgelig ned hit uansett, men jeg skulle egentlig reist tirsdag kveld. Og når de ringte og sa at de hadde fått med seg med Anthony Scaramucci, så sa jeg sånn, jeg må ringe pappa. Og pappa jobber jo egentlig med finansmarkedene, så han hørte Anthony Scaramucci og finans, og sa han, jeg passer på babyen. Så tusen takk til pappa for at jeg får lov til å være her. Vi skal snakke om de lange linjene, og om hvor vi er geopolitisk. Og om 2 uker så er det akkurat 20 år siden jeg begynte å studere, som er en veldig rar følelse, for det betyr at jeg nærmer meg 40 med stormskritt. Nå er jeg ikke helt tatt innover meg ennå. Men jeg møtte en professor. Jeg hadde første studier for noen uker siden. Jeg tror ikke jeg har sett han på 15-20 år. Og vi snakket om hvor mye verden har endret seg, for jeg begynte å studere internasjonale relasjoner i London september 2005, til den verden vi lever i nå. Og jeg tror de gamle professorene mine i London sitter fortsatt og krangler om hva utfallet av den brytningstiden vi lever i. Men jeg tror hele fakultetet er ganske enig om at vi lever i en brytningstid nå. Og det er jo veldig spennende å leve i en slags brytningstid, men det er også veldig stressende. For man må jo prøve å navigere denne urolige tiden som vi lever i. Og professoren min hadde nylig skrevet en bok om markedet og internasjonale relasjoner. Og markedet har jo ofte blitt sett på som en litt sånn sideting fra internasjonale relasjoner. Men hans hovedpoeng da, og jeg tror han sjelden har gitt ut en bok som var mer aktuell enn det den er nå, var at markedene har nå blitt en veldig viktig del av geopolitikk. Den tidsalderen vi har levd i økonomisk, med frihandel, globalisering, en vei fremover, den er over. Og nå er vi inne i noe litt annet. Og derfor skal vi ha dagens panel. Og vi har en ekstremt kompetent gjeng som skal opp på scenen. Men aller først så skal jeg invitere tilbake the one and only Mr. Anthony Scaramucci, who, as said before, is the former White House Communications Director, and he's also the founder of Skybridge Capital, and he's the co-host of one of my absolute favorite podcasts on U.S. politics, which is The Rest is Politics US. So Anthony, please come back out.
Which one?
You can stand here if you want.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
I mean, I have so many questions for you.
Okay.
But I thought we could start with a simple question. And that is, for those of us who are not economists, who don't follow the markets the same way that you do, what is the status of things right now with Trump's trade policies? Like, where are we at?
Well, so if it's okay, I have to take a little bit of a step back because I think what people need to understand is that the United States set up the trading system to be uneven. And maybe you guys studied that in school. Most Americans, frankly, didn't study that. But at the end of the Second World War, when the U.S. had 50% of the world's economic output and about 2% of the world's population, they knew that they had to make things uneven so that they could help create rising living standards around the rest of the world and help to reindustrialize Europe at the end of the Second World War. So the general agreement of trade and tariffs was very uneven. We then transitioned from that into the World Trade Organization, and because the Berlin Wall came down, we were probably a little overconfident. We were fortified with that success, and so President Clinton let the Chinese into that agreement, converted it to the World Trade Organization, and people, again, in the U.S. don't know this, but we let the Chinese in with the handle of being an emerging market. So they were able to protect their markets. We were able to allow their goods and services to flow fairly freely into the U.S. And then the last piece of this is that the Nixon administration allowed the Chinese to link their currency to our currency in the mid-'70s. And that really helped the Chinese because as they were industrializing, the U.S. was monetizing its deficit and creating a lot of inflation. So the value of the dollar was going down, and it was bringing the Chinese renminbi down, which accelerated their exports. Why am I bringing all this up? Is that the current president of the United States, rather than understanding the social engineering parts of that, has rejected that wholly and thinks it was unfair to the U.S. And there's always kernels of truth in what he's saying. Our administrations in the past should have probably checked that and should have probably right-sized it along the way. They didn't do that. And so now he's doing something that's very blunt, which is going after the whole trading system in a much more aggressive way, which I think is long-term harmful to the interests of the world and arguably long-term harmful to the U.S. because it hurts our soft power, our image around the world. But it's important to lay that out as a backdrop of where we are. And so Robert Lighthizer, who was the U.S. trade representative in the first administration, thought that the measures that President Trump wanted to take in Trump 2 were too far. So he's not in the administration as a result of this. So the tariffs are going to be roughly 10 to 15% across the board. That's where they're roughly looking. That will slow down the U.S. economy. People will push back on me that are his supporters and say, well, stock market's at an all-time high. The economy's still showing reasonable strength. What you're saying is not true. But if you really look at it, we're front-loading a lot of the capital investments and a lot of exports. You know, the containers of Hermes scarves and bags that showed up in the first quarter in the United States was 6 times what was usual to front-load prior to the tariffs kicking in. So I'm giving you a long-winded answer, but I think it's very important to explain all the context of this. So I'll just say 3 quick things. Number 1, it will slow down the U.S. economy. Number 2, I know this country is trying to get a trade agreement together with the U.S. It'll probably be closer to where the EU is. It'll probably be a 15% handle on tariffs, which will be painful, and your companies will probably have to absorb some of that. But long-term, the consumer in the U.S. will be the real victim of all this. And then the last thing is, I predict this, before the end of his administration, all of those tariffs will have to come down because it will eventually have weakened the U.S. economy. Remember, this is a consumption tax on the American people. This is like the Americans imposing, on top of the aggressive income taxes, you're imposing a VAT. And of course, it's very regressive because the poor are going to pay a larger percentage of their income to these sorts of tariffs than the rich. So it's a very painful, stupid thing to do.
I was listening to your podcast this summer, and you described the situation right now as the tariffs are a big antelope, and the snake is just eating it, and it sort of has to go through the snake system. It hasn't quite digested the consequences or the full. And like how? I mean, I understand that's a very difficult question, but I think from our perspective, we're wondering, when will the U.S. consumer understand what you just said about this being a tax on?
Starting to. A lot of people are starting to realize that their They're looking at goods that they're purchasing and saying, whoa, those goods are higher. Remember, if you're building a Boeing aircraft in the United States, 60% of the parts, the U.S. does not make flat screens. I don't know if the Norwegians do, but I can tell you, we haven't made a television since the 1970s, and so never made a flat screen. Those screens you see on the planes, they've got to come in from Asia, and so you've got high tariffs there. It's slowed down the production. If you're trying to buy an American car in the U.S. because of the aluminum tariffs, the steel tariffs, the component tariffs, it's slowing down the delivery cycle and it's increasing the costs of the car. So you're starting to see people complain on the margin and you're starting to see demand slip. You may have seen the economic data. I guess it was about 10 days ago now, the Bureau of Labor and Statistics revised economic data to show that the economy was weaker. Of course, the president didn't like those numbers, so he fired the person, you know. It's like you're shooting the messenger for the bad news, you know. It's like the old king doesn't like the message, so he kills the messenger. So, you know, and again, Wall Street has taken the position, rightly or wrongly, that this will be a pain. It will slow down the economy. It won't cause the economy to go into a depression. Concomitant to everything I'm saying, you're seeing lots of productivity growth as a result of software improvements, AI, robotic technology, et cetera. So there's a mixed bag happening at the same time. It's just, unfortunately, these policies are not, they're not pro-growth oriented policies.
Because I think this is one of the questions that you've also discussed on the podcast these last few weeks, is that the markets aren't reacting, as you said. They've sort of made this, you described as, they've made this sort of bet that this is going to be 3.5 years and there's going to be something different at the end of those 3.5 years.
Yeah, and they're also making the bet that we're going to have rate cuts. So
yeah.
So again, if you really study inflation, one thing I would recommend everybody here, there's a website called trueflation.com. And so the way we aggregate the inflation data at the Federal Reserve level, in my opinion, I think the opinion of many economists, is quite antiquated. And this is why we're having these lagging results and we're always forcing ourselves to have revisions. But you can get real-time inflation data from trueflation.com. And what they've done is they've put monitors on cash registers around the United States in various parts of the country. They're monitoring wages. They've got agreements with unions to look at what labor wages are and so forth. And so if you go to trueflation.com, you'll see the inflation numbers are probably about 80 to 100 basis points lower than what the Federal Reserve is saying or what the CPI index is saying. And so the Wall Streeters are looking at that saying there's going to be a rate cut, could be as much as 50 basis points in September, given how far behind the Fed is right now. And of course, if that happens, that's going to be very good for the stock market.
And then you, as you say, you have this mixed bag where you have the tariffs, but you have other indicators that are keeping the economy looking perhaps better than what some of the experts had predicted prior to Liberation Day.
Yeah, and remember, there's a lot of cash on the balance sheet of the S&P right now. So what they're doing is they're buying back stock. In the last decade, it's hard to believe this statistic, but I looked it up last night to just make sure I was right about this. In the last decade, Apple has bought back $700 billion of its stock. So they're averaging about $70 billion a year of share repurchases, and they're still sitting on cash and cash equivalents of about $300 billion. So the companies have done well, and they're going to absorb some of the costs of the tariffs for now, and they're going to buy back their stock to help support the market. So for those reasons, most people on Wall Street are cautiously optimistic.
Right. I think from a Norwegian perspective, I think, as I told you before, I had your former colleague, Kellyanne Shaw, here last year, who was one of Trump's top trade advisors in the first Trump administration. And she was trying to explain his whole philosophy behind tariffs. And I think from
How'd she do? Was she able to explain it?
In the best possible way, I think. You know, I think she pressed upon us.
Because he doesn't understand it himself, so I'm just wondering if she was able to explain it.
Something about how we had to right-size the system, and that the Democrats also want to right-size trade, but Trump was just going to do it a little faster.
Well, listen, I think that if you have protected markets in this state of modernity as it relates to the industrialized world, if you have protective markets, you have to unfortunately have some reciprocity. And so let me give you an example. If the Koreans or the Chinese have state sponsorship. So meaning the government is helping the private company and they're providing subsidies to the private company so that they can dump their steel at very low prices into the American market. And the Americans are not doing that because they have like a sort of a separation between the government and the private enterprise. Then it's important for the Americans to protect their private companies by having tariffs. So I'm not a person that says no tariffs and so on and so forth. You have to have measures in place to protect your market if you're being assaulted in your own market. But the big problem with the president is doing is that he's not going about it in a surgical way. He's going about it in a way to flex and to sort of create some level of intimidation and some level of harm, in my opinion, to our reputation and our soft power. I don't think the United States needs to do this, and I'll just give this example. I'll take it to your home. Let's say you have a blue-collar family member, and you're in a blue-collar family, and one of the family members does really well. And that person maybe buys a few cars for their family or helps people with their down payments on their houses or helps on medical expenses. Let's take another family. This would be Trump's family as an example. Let's say he does very well. He builds himself a mansion and he has a swimming pool, but now he wants to charge his family members $25 to come into the swimming pool. Which family is going to do better? So the United States still, particularly for the West, it's still the largest economy by quite a lot, actually, and it still has very high per capita GDP. It should be in a position of helping the free world. We have done better as a country when we do that. I think we'll do worse as a country if we start to flex on each other. Every time that's happened, it's led to some very bad political outcomes.
And I think, from a European perspective, it's been sort of fascinating seeing the Republican Party go from being a free trade party to being what it is now. Do you think that's going to change with a change of administration? Let's say a J.D. Vance is elected in 3.5 years, or someone else. Okay,
so first of all, J.D. Vance is not going to get reelected, not going to be elected in 3.5 years. I just want you to go to your phone and look at the memes of J.D. Vance where he looks like the Cabbage Patch doll, and he's got the big fat belly. I mean, hopefully you'll invite me back. If I'm wrong, you can dunk me in the Ford over here. But I'm just, this guy's not going to get elected. First of all, Trump has already put J.D. Vance partially into the wood chipper. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the movie Fargo, where they're putting the guy in the wood chipper. Okay, there's no chance that Vance is getting elected because Trump kills everything
in his orbit.
Okay, and so ask Vice President Pence how his political career is going. Okay, has not going so well, and so this whole notion that Vance is going to survive the Trump administration, I don't buy the argument. I think Rubio has totally disgraced himself. You want to talk about somebody that was for free trade and somebody that was for the American system and the post-World War II order. He's disavowed all of that now. So how could you really trust Rubio in any situation? Moreover, Rubio signed the documents. This is the great irony. Trump is now telling you to distract from the Epstein situation, that he's going to arrest Barack Obama and he's going to arrest Hillary Clinton. And so what evidence are you providing? Well, the evidence he's providing is from a document that was completely the opposite of what he's saying. So the document that was produced by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which exonerated Obama and Hillary Clinton and was signed by the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Marco Rubio, is the document that he's using. So he's going to disgrace those people. I think the real battle will happen in the Republican Party after the midterms. And I submit to you guys that the party now is under the personality cult of Donald Trump. He decapitated the traditional Republicans. He did an M&A transaction, and he installed his people inside the party, and he's now effectively flexed and intimidated the politicians to fall into line with his thinking. But J.D. Vance couldn't hold that together any more than Marco Rubio. When the president was discussing the bombing of Iran, and if you remember, he campaigned on no more forever wars, no more distracting bombs in the Middle East. Of course, he started bombing them. He then campaigned on, we're going to release the Epstein files and expose all the pedophilia. And then, obviously, his buddy Elon Musk said, well, you happen to be in the files. No files. Not going to release them. And so he can do this because of what he said. I want you to hear his own words, not mine. Mr. President, what are the policies and the philosophies and the principles of MAGA? And his answer, his own words, not mine, whatever I want them to be. Just think about that. Which politician can hold that ground like that? He's the only one. And so again, you can like or dislike him, but he is a formidable politician. And I think that fever breaks after the American midterms in November of 2026.
You think after the midterms, that's when the Republican Party is going to start looking for...
I do. You know, Marjorie Taylor Greene is already breaking from him. Rand Paul is already breaking from him. I think Thune will break from him. Remember, behind the scenes in Washington, he's getting a lot of pressure on him from the Republican congressmen. Republican congressmen have descended on the White House and said, listen, we've had a long-standing alliance with Europe 30 years ago, 31 years ago to be exact. We signed security guarantees with Ukraine. People in this room may remember, but the sixth largest nuclear arsenal was in Ukraine. Now, that was a remnant of the Soviet Union, but it was there. That's where the missile silos were. And the President Clinton at that time, exchanged security guarantees for those nukes. We were trying to denuclearize, and we were trying to prevent nuclear proliferation, and we signed security guarantees. And so the Congress has leaned on the President and said, you know, we really can't let a democratic nation like Ukraine, whatever the corruption is in Ukraine, whatever their problems, we can't allow this aggression to stand. Now, Trump has a love affair with Putin, and Putin probably has something on him, because you can't really describe the relationship without putting that piece into the puzzle. How is the person running the largest economy with the largest military kowtowing to a person that has a weakened economy, a very weakened military, and has actually had his economy shrink 14% in the last 3.5 years? The Russian economy is now below the GDP of Italy, just to understand the damage that's happened to Russia. And yet Vladimir Putin's flexing on Donald Trump. That means that there's something there that he's very afraid of. And I don't know exactly what it is. I don't think any of us do. But I don't think it's just because he likes strong men. I don't believe that. And the Congress is putting a lot of pressure on him, which is why they're having that summit, which I predict will not amount to much.
We're going to get back to the summit, but first I would like to invite the rest of the panel to come join us. Robin Wigglesworth is an editor at the Financial Times. Magnus Reitan, who was just here, is the CEO of Reitan Capital. And Kari Due Andresen is the managing partner of Akershus Eiendom. Please come to the stage. Now, Robin, I thought I would start with you because much of my information about these trade wars I get from the Financial Times. And, you know, you're covering this really, really thoroughly, really, really well. Where are we at right now?
Oh, God, where to begin? Well, it seems to have died down a little bit. As we're talking about, we seem to be settling around sort of a base level of 10, 15%. The question is whether we stay there and whether this is sort of a first half of the sort of presidency thing. I mean, so far it's been notable for its chaos, its incoherence, its capriciousness, and it's how personalized it becomes. To use an example, Switzerland will suddenly start with 39% tariff rate, higher than they had in the sort of Liberation Day tariffs. But that's because they have a massive current account surplus with the US. But that is almost only because of gold bar imports and pharma. And lo and behold, they exempted gold and pharma from the tariff rate. Yeah. So it just seems, incoherent. And then you have the sight of literally the head of one of America's biggest companies and turning up in the White House with a solid gold bar, basically, handing it to the president. And, you know, you can see they benefit. They're making sidecar deals with NVIDIA about chip exports to the United States. So I think everybody wants it to be over. And kind of after the nightmare, maybe he managed to lower expectations sufficiently earlier this year that actually sort of 10, 15% seems livable, tolerable. And the reality is that, you know, as Anthony was saying, there's a kernel of truth to a lot of what he does, or at least some of the stuff he does, that people do want access to the world's biggest market. They do, and they are willing to pay for that. Even though Americans are really paying for it, it obviously disadvantages foreign imports. The question is whether we stay this way, and whether if you're an American businessman, an owner, an investor abroad, whether just the chaos, how do you make decisions? I mean, I'm very glad I just have to write about this.
Speaking of decisions, that gives me a perfect segue to you, Magnus, because you're having to make decisions in all of this.
Yeah, we have to, and there's a lot of, it's not easy to maneuver in this type of environment. And I think, in general, it's just the trade war as such is negative, even if it's finished already, or if it will go on and escalate even more. But there are no winners in a trade war. That's my take on it. And ironically, U.S. is the biggest loser. Every economic analysis that I've seen from reputable sources, they conclude the same. The U.S. is the biggest loser from this trade war. Like Anthony said, U.S. businesses will face higher input costs, consumers will face higher inflation, and the interest rates will stay high. And I think the EU's decision or strategy to not retaliate against the US tariffs, you can see that as weakness from the EU or smartness. Perhaps it's smart that they did exactly that, because it will keep inflation in Europe down, it will keep interest rates down, and it will hopefully lead to more economic growth, despite these tariff headwinds.
We're going to get back to Europe because I think that's really interesting to analyze how they've handled these last few weeks. But Kali, I turn to you now. You're an economist. How do you look at this trade war? Is it a zero-sum game where people are winning? Are they losing? Who's up? Who's down?
Oh, I agree with Magnus. I think everyone's losing here. I think it's a negative-sum game. In any case, tariffs are really just a tax on importers and consumers. So tariffs, the way I see it, reduce efficiency. And also, because of all of this uncertainty that is introduced, I think many companies, they choose resilience now over efficiency. Yeah. So I think this means that economic potential is lost. But I think the most worrisome development here, at least from a Norwegian perspective, is that the United States really doesn't act like a friend anymore, really doesn't act like an ally that we recognize anymore, doesn't act like a responsible international player. I think because of the rivalry between the US and China, we're seeing kind of a fragmentation of the international rules-based order that we used to know. And I think this introduces a lot of uncertainty. It makes investors take sides. And that really implies that maybe capital doesn't flow that freely anymore.
I think that's a really interesting point. And you've talked a lot about this in the podcast, the breakdown of the international world order that we've been living in since the Second World War. And this sort of brings me to our second topic, which is the Fed and Treasury. Because it's not just these tariffs, it's also a Trump administration that's been playing with the fire of maybe firing the Fed chair. Last week, we saw that Trump appointed a new economist onto the Fed board, Stephen Miran. Is he going to he's stepping down in, May? Well, do you think he's going to get fired?
No, yeah. I don't think he's going to get fired, but his term ends in May. And so, yes, he's going to be, I would say, because Trump is so arbitrary at times, you can't say 100%, but it's probably 99% that he'll be replaced in May. The Moran is interesting because he's another Trump sycophant, so he'll vote alongside of the guys on the committee. But remember, the guys on the committee can more or less have an argument, they can have a persuasion, but the person that's really making the policy is the Fed chair. And so what I find interesting is that Kevin Warsh is probably the one that's in the pole position to replace Jerome Powell. But in 2017, Trump said that Kevin Warsh was too hawkish for him.
Okay.
So remember, we had Janet Yellen, Jerome Powell and Kevin Warsh were the three people that were being interviewed for the job. He didn't want to put Yellen back in the post because it was an Obama appointee, and he thought Warsh was too hawkish. So Kevin spent the last 6 or 7 years trying to explain to people that he's not hawkish, but he is hawkish. Yeah. So what'll be interesting is if he appoints Warsh, he could end up in a bad situation because the Fed has a lot of independence, and Warsh may or may not do what Trump wants. Trump wants to jam rates down to zero. He doesn't care what the bond market's dictating or what the economy's dictating. That's what he wants.
But this is one of the questions I get a lot. Does he understand what he's doing? Does Trump understand what he's doing when he puts into question the independence of the Fed, or looks away from U.S. Treasury bonds, or
I think from his perspective, he understands what he's doing. I think that he doesn't have our perspective. Our perspective is you want an independent Fed, which will help to create lots of predictability in capital markets. You want an independent judiciary that will protect the system of property in the United States so international investors feel comfortable that there's a decentralized system of predictability. But from the president's point of view, he doesn't want that. The president wants to be king, and the president wants to jam rates down to zero and get the growth up. He thinks that will get the growth up. It'll have the opposite effect, actually, because it'll scare international investors out of the system. So, so here's something that I will say. We were not scarred from the Second World War the way the Europeans were. The Germans did not occupy our country. The Germans didn't bomb our country. There's no war sites where we take our school children like they do in France to Normandy, or perhaps the Churchill War camp. So the Americans are not like the Europeans. When they see this type of behavior, they have more institutional, more family memory of this type of behavior, which is why he has an 80% disapproval rating here. But in the U.S., this is like a new experiment for the U.S. This is, okay, a big, strong man that's going to flex on everybody. This may be good for us. This may eliminate some of the sloppiness of our democracy, but it's very bad for us. And historically, it's never worked. But from Trump's perspective, that's what he wants.
Magnus, you were nodding your head at capital, becoming more risk averse.
Yeah, I think so, and is also investors, global investors, are looking to other regions than the U.S. right now because of the politics and because of the institutions in the U.S. being challenged like this. So it's increasingly, international investors are exhibiting home bias, the tendency to invest more at home and in their own region, and that's been happening this year as well, taking cash away from the U.S. and to Europe, among other things. Which, you no longer have capital flowing to where it's most productive, as Kari mentioned as well, which is bad for economic growth, which is also bad for the return potential on a global portfolio. So, yeah.
I think that's really interesting. And Robin, how do you think? I feel like I get most of my information about this from the Financial Times, so it feels really good to ask you these questions.
Same here, really. Yeah. I just read it really well.
Yeah. But what?
Did you come up with the taco thing? Was that what you?
No, it was my colleague Rob. He's so proud, and then he really regretted it. It's become a bit of an albatross. But,
sorry.
Yeah.
But from your perspective, what does it look like if the independence of the Fed is put into question?
Bad. We've been here before. I think it is important that we always think our current time is exceptional and difficult and awful, and in reality, there are lots of bad times. And people forget, like Nixon sent Canale to send over, Canale, the Treasury Secretary under Nixon, said that his job was to screw foreigners before they screwed us. These aren't entirely new sentiments. They're just more chaotic and more strongly worded now, and obviously some of the policies are messy. Fed independence has been under pressure in the past from both Democrats and Republican presidents. One of the reasons why we try to have semi-independent or fully independent central banks is because we know they're always, it's a very tempting thing. Even politicians here in Norway have done this, pressure the central bank to lower rates when it's convenient for them. what's unique about the US situation is that the Fed isn't just the American central bank, it's the world central bank. Like, what happens there, it's not like Vegas, it doesn't stay there. You know, it echoes everywhere. And I think some of the candidates talked about, you know, frankly, we are choosing from an option of least bad options here, really. Nobody that Trump is going to nominate to be the chair is going to be somebody personally, and maybe I might think might do a good job. But there are people there that are kind of, I put in the vaguely sane camp. Then there are people who are clearly, like Judy Shelton, who's a complete nutcase, is the fifth favorite runner. I mean, she's only 3%, but like she's in the running. Stephen Moran, a complete sycophant. I mean, he has a Harvard economics PhD, so he's got sort of the veneer of legitimacy. But everything he's been writing and saying for quite a while now is stuff that would have severe global ramifications. There are other candidates that, you know, I mean, Pulte. I mean, if that guy becomes nominated Fed chair, then it's sort of the end of the global financial system, I think. But
no
I don't think, as Anthony said, like, Trump, my impression, and I'm just an observer, he seems to be a man driven by instinct. And sometimes those instincts align to something that has a kernel of truth to them as well. Like, for example, there are things about the global trading system that could have been improved. The dollar's role is both a blessing and a burden to the US economy. But I think he knows somehow, even though he doesn't seem to understand how interest rates work, actually. He's a real estate developer. I want low interest rates, ergo I want a low rates guy in. But if they choose one of the headbangers, frankly, the bond market will puke, and long-end interest rates will go up, and you'll cause a very swift financial crisis, and at the very least, increase the cost of America's borrowing. And that's not what he wants. So I suspect, or I hope, the people around him will explain this, and he'll choose some of the saner options. But like, of the stuff that I've been worried about, like even trade wars, like this stuff is very disruptive and painful, but it's a tax. It's a tax on American consumption of overseas goods. And look, frankly, maybe the Americans should be raising taxes. I mean, maybe they should. Maybe there's a way you could do this.
But Robin, it's a regressive tax. That's the problem with it. It's going to hurt the poor and the living standards of the middle income people way more than the wealthy.
Completely. On
a percentage of disposable income. So it is a tax, but it's from a social engineering perspective, it's a really poor way to tax people.
Yeah, it's not one that, frankly, helps his base a lot.
Well, I listened to the Joe Rogan podcast last year, and Trump talked at length there about how if you introduce tariffs, not only can they, can we pay for all our national debt that way, we can also remove the income tax. Yeah.
No, he's talking back to the age of Herbert Hoover, well, in the 18th century, when all the taxes were on liquor and customs taxes. But like he said, I mean, tariffs is the most beautiful word in the English language. It's his one kind of economic constant.
Anthony, what do you think?
Well, I mean, Hoover was, probably the worst of the Republican presidents. But I think where Trump really lives is with Bill McKinley. McKinley was the one that put up lots of restrictions and lots of protective tariffs. But remember, it's a different era of the world back then, and the United States didn't have the economic standing that it has now. I can't mention his name because it would be unfair to the person, but I had one of the former Trump 1 cabinet officials in my office a few weeks ago, and he said that the problem is that they want to break America away from the rest of the system. They want to Brexit America from the rest of the world. It's almost like an Amexit. And they want to wall the country off literally and physically from the rest of the world. And could America survive that? We have enough natural resources where perhaps we could, but it would be absolutely devastating to the global economy, and it would always come back and haunt America. Just remember, Franklin Roosevelt was dealing with lots of isolationists. But he put them down. He was politically adept, and he was able. Remember, the first America First movement was Charles Lindbergh, and it was Huey Long. I don't know if you remember these great populists. And Lindbergh wanted to have an American Nazi party, but Roosevelt was very successful at putting them down. Now it's like if Charles Lindbergh had like a baby with Joe McCarthy and named him Donald Trump. I mean, that's what we got, and they raised the baby with Roy Cohn. I mean, that's what we got going on.
That is an image I will not get out of my head.
Yeah. So that's, I hope I horrified everybody sufficiently by saying that, but now, how do you combat that? And the answer is we don't really have a formidable politician right now that's going to capture the imagination of the American people. The Democrats are fighting with each other, and the Republicans are too afraid of Trump.
Macaulay, this leads me to my next question to you, which is that if we expand this to a discussion about geopolitics and finance, as you're saying, the question is, how does the rest of the world react to a Mexit or an exit of the U.S. From the world markets in the way that we've known? Do we create a free trading bloc without the U.S.? What do you think?
Well, I just wanted to say first that if the markets lose confidence in the Fed because it's not independent anymore, then monetary policy doesn't really work. You cannot use monetary policy to fix the American economy or the world economy for that matter. So that would be a huge problem, I think. When it comes to these other questions, I think it's become more and more clear to me the way that the US is acting is that national security concerns will trump economic concerns every time. And Trump has made the security guarantee through NATO contingent on us making the right economic decisions in his view. I think that's really scary. It's led to us spending more on defense, Europe spending more on defense, so the coming decade is ramping up spending on defense and infrastructure, which might be a good thing, but for the wrong reasons. And Norway, as a small country, we're finding ourselves in a squeeze then between the US on the one side, which is our military ally, and China on the other side, which is an economic superpower, and is a country that we, under normal circumstances, would see closer ties with. Actually, for several years, we were trying to get a free trade agreement with China. That process is now stopped, right? So I will say it again, national security concerns will eat economic concerns for breakfast. That means our economic choices are limited because of this situation we're finding ourselves in. I think that's really bad for economic growth and on so many levels.
Because I think that's really interesting, because if you try and analyze this sort of fragmented world that we're living in right now, then one of the bigger trends is that you talk about decoupling or fragmented globalization or regionalization, that we're trading more within our regions. But I think, as you say, it's bigger than that. It's also linked to national security, because from our perspective, I feel like when my students have asked me, how do we get into a situation where we're this dependent on the U.S.? Can't we just break up with the U.S.? And the answer to that is we can't really break up with the U.S. We are like a samboerskap, where you didn't pay anything into the house, and so you wake up one day and you realize this guy is saying a lot of weird things right now. I'm not so sure about this anymore. But you own nothing, or you own very little. You can't actually, break out from the relationship, and that's a little bit where we're at. And I think it's interesting how Trump uses power politics to sort of put those national interests to the forefront. I look at both you, Robin, and Magnus, because this brings me back to the EU deal. The EU deal has been criticized, when it first came out. Why do we enter in such a weak agreement? But Magnus, you're saying Europe is playing the long game here.
Yeah, I think it's smarter than it looks. So hopefully it will lead to lower inflation and better economic growth in Europe, and the US will finally realize that they are the biggest loser in a war that they started. And hopefully within the next few years something will happen to American politics as well, and maybe we'll have a global backlash or global pushback to the whole trade war regime. Maybe after Trump, the world will get together. Everyone will understand that we need to work together. This is my big wet dream, but hopefully it will happen, because everyone will see that this was madness.
That is a positive vision for the future.
I like the wet dream part.
Yeah.
That's how we roll these days. We're middle-aged men.
But Robin, from your perspective, this national security, military versus economic interests in navigating global markets now. How do you look at that? Do you agree with Kari?
Yes, very much so. And although I agree that the Europeans, it was smart, maybe what they did, because I don't think that we should self-harm ourselves just to prove a point to the Americans. I do think it is very much really it revealed our weakness.
Yeah.
So I don't think it was smart. It was smartness born out of desperation, and then my sort of. Look, I'm a middle-aged man, so obviously I've got views on the geoeconomics that I have no backing for.
Right. I'm going to be your life coach. Stop
saying, okay, yeah, going through a crisis.
I'm like 15 years older than you, and you're not a middle-aged man.
You seem to have done quite well, though.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
well,
okay, let's...
Just a lot of makeup and Botox and stuff. I can help you
a
out.
guy afterwards?
I will. Yeah. Let me see the back of your head.
Yeah.
You're going to be okay. Stop with the middle-aged stuff.
But look, NATO, for example, which has been a foundation stone of European security politics, certainly here in Norway for a long time. I think we just have to assume, I mean, this is something we didn't really deal with after the first Trump term, that I think Merkel said publicly, and now she said it privately to somebody I know, that if America voted for a Trump once, they can vote for a Trump again. Yep. And they literally voted for the Trump again. And we didn't really grapple with the consequences. But if something like NATO could become transactional, if there's any doubt of the sanctity of Article 5, what value is that defense alliance? So I think sometimes we're still kind of dancing a little around the bushes and talking about sort of a bifurcating world, and these are all things true, but there are very practical things that I think, at least in Europe, yes, we are investing more in sort of building arms but a lot of this money is like, I mean, Italy, I saw some of the money they say the defense spending is actually building roads and bridges in Naples. And maybe that has a military purpose, but Europeans can pad their spending in many ways. So, look, I think we're pointing in the right direction. I just worry that we can't go back to Magnus's more optimistic view that this is a breaking point in the arc of history, and I don't quite like where we're going.
Anthony, I think I get a lot of different questions, but one of them is why. What has Europe done for Trump to dislike Europe so much? It is, as Kari said, sort of the feeling of waking up to like.
He's Scottish. Is that the reason? No, so, all right, this is not my view, but I'm going to explain his view. So Trump believes, rightly or wrongly, I don't believe this, but I'm telling you, he believes this, that the European Union was set up to economically harm the United States. And then you say to yourself, all right, you're shaking your head. Of course, I don't believe that, and you guys don't believe that, but he believes that. And so let me take you through the layers of his geometric proof. He believes that the northern European countries like Germany, and France got together with Portugal and Italy and Greece and Spain to depreciate their currency. So if the Deutschmark was trading freely today, it would be trading at a premium to where the euro is right now. So the euro, as we all know in this room, which is probably one of the reasons why the Norwegians elected not to be a part of it, is a fixed exchange rate mechanism. But it's not appropriately tied because you don't have the fiscal policy intertwined with the monetary policy. Everybody's running their own fiscal policy, and so effectively it's a fixed exchange rate mechanism. So what Trump would say to you, if he could really articulate it, this is more instinctive, but I'm explaining to you how he thinks because I've traveled with him. He thinks that the French and the Germans have gamed the system by entering into the euro to promote their exports relative to the United States. So that's what he thinks. And so that's where his soreness comes from, and that's why he's always saying that the Europeans are taking advantage of us. So again, there's easy ways to rebut that, but that's his worldview. One other point that I think is necessary, because Europeans have this problem on their side, assets and liabilities. They're probably underinvested in their defense. They probably overinvested in their reliance on America as a great friend and a great trading partner, and I think it's very disappointing to see where we all are. And believe me, it breaks my heart because I'm an American and I certainly don't want to be in this position, so it absolutely breaks my heart. But on the American side of the equation, because what Robin said is always, it's true about Trump, there are kernels of truth. We had no natural minerals policy in the U.S. So all these rare earth minerals that we need, the U.S., maybe we can find them in Utah now, but we have a scarcity of those, and we've been overly reliant on places like China, believe it or not, Canada, other places. In addition to that, our manufacturing capabilities and our steel-making capabilities are below where they should be from a national security perspective. Because you're right, national security will eat the economy for breakfast. But if you were in the National Security Agency of the United States and said, okay, we're going to go to war, well, our chips are made in Taiwan, we have no rare earth minerals, we don't produce enough steel to supply the military if we needed to. And so there's lots of imbalances that are going on around the world that need to be rectified. Now, if you had a really genuine and benevolent leader in the American president, I think it could be rectified in a way where everybody would be happy. But you don't have that. You have somebody that really hates himself. Okay, don't forget this about Trump. Like, the Monroe Doctrine was stay out of the Western Hemisphere. The Truman Doctrine was let's contain communism. The Trump Doctrine is I hate myself, and I'm going to inflict my hatred and pain on you. And I'm going to find ways to do that. And that's him. And whether you like it or not, that's him. And it's causing a lot of problems in the country. And those senators that are with him right now, they know what I'm saying is true. And so I don't see the wet dream, although I love the wet dream. But I don't see the apocalypse either, because what will happen is he is a decaying political asset. Every day that goes by from now into the midterms, he is getting weaker. Even if he's flexing and hyper-masculating, all the stupid stuff that he does, he's getting weaker, and there will be a big break and an eventual civil war in that party.
And that is going to give us US commentators in Norway plenty to talk about, so I'm looking forward to it. Kari, I thought we would spend the last 10 odd minutes on Norway, because, you know, you spend most of your time analyzing the Norwegian economy. You know, how does Norway navigate this? What's important for us right now?
Yeah, well, I think one of the most important things we can do for our politicians, so we have an election coming up, is that we should really make sure we're friends with the EU. Because 85% of our trade goes to Europe. Only 4% to the US, actually. So we should really stay friends with the EU when the US is alienating itself. When it comes to monetary policy, we are just exposed to what happens in the world economy. As a small open economy, we are exposed to what happens in the Fed, what Trump does. It affects our exchange rate, therefore our imported inflation. We're heavily dependent on oil prices, energy prices. So it's very important for a small economy like Norway that the world economy doesn't go off its hinges. So, yeah, I think in the short term, this is bad for markets. It's more uncertainty, lower production potential. But I'm more worried about the national security perspective, actually. And I also don't think that the wet dream will happen because I think this rivalry between the US and China will go on after Trump.
Magnus is regretting the wet dream.
And yeah, so as I said, I think that's limiting our economic options because national security trumps the economy.
Magnus, I'm going to let you steer away from the wet dream and onto...
It was quite a winner, though, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. It really was.
It wasn't quite taco, but it was pretty good.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask
I get
you...
an FT column sometime.
Good. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to put on your other hat from the Reitan's group's perspective at large.
Yeah.
You know, how do you see this for the Norwegian economy?
First of all, wet dreams aren't always realistic. That's
important. That's important.
So no, I think for Reitan specifically for our company, you know, we are in 7 countries, especially here in the Nordics. I think anything that's bad for the Nordic consumer is bad for our business. But hopefully what's happening in Europe right now will lead to lower inflation, lower interest rates, and that will spill over to the Norwegian and the Nordic economies. So hopefully the outlook is fairly neutral for us.
That's good.
Yeah.
Anthony, I'm going to give you the last question of this panel because as you touched upon, Norway is trying to negotiate a trade agreement. And I feel like the last few months, you've seen European leader after European leader come to Trump, try and understand how do we navigate him, what do we do? What's your best advice for European leaders who are trying to hustle a trade deal?
Well, I would stay out of his way. I don't think your prime minister needs to be humiliated like these other Western leaders, or all leaders get humiliated in the Oval Office reality TV ritual. And I would have your trade representatives work with Rubio and work with Howard Lutnick to get the deal done, and the deal will probably end up close to where the EU is. And, you know, it's going to be a 15% deal. I don't know what the capital surplus balances are between Norway and the U.S. I'm not sure what they are. If they're high like Switzerland, that'll upset the president. But I don't think it's a, you know, I don't think it's a, my overriding message is keep your prime minister. I know you have a big election coming up in September. Who's ever your prime minister, keep him away from Trump, because you just don't need the aggravation that he presents. You know, think about what he did to Starmer, right? He brought Starmer to his house in Scotland. Okay, first of all, if like Starmer bought a house on the Potomac, the president would not be visiting him at the house as his guest, right? And he tried to embarrass him. He tried to humiliate him, and that's what he wants to do to everybody. And so, again, you have to see it through the prism of his own self-hatred to really understand him, and keep your prime minister away from him is what I would say.
And if he does come, gold bar. Gold bar is the trick.
And if he does come, make sure that he's a co-producer in the reality show.
Right.
Because if you're a B-level actor, you're going to get buried. Zelensky went in there unprepared. The president of South Africa went in there unprepared. But Mark Carney was very prepared. Mark Carney called Susie Wiles and said, okay, number one, I'm the prime minister. He can't say the word governor to me during the meeting or in the post-meeting. Number two, he can't mention the 51st state. It's the sovereign country of Canada. And then what Carney said, who's going to be in the meeting? What are we going to talk about? What videos are going to be showed in the meeting after he embarrassed the South African president by showing videos of Botswana? It wasn't even in the guy's country. The guy couldn't even, like, respond, okay? And so, and then he's, like, looking at the, oh, you speak perfect English, he said to the one guy, where the English is like the language of the country.
Yep.
And you guys are, like, saying, okay, that's Trump being an idiot. It's not being an idiot. He's trying to humiliate the person. Okay, that you have to look at it through that prism. And so if your prime minister is going to the Oval Office, make sure somebody is co-producing and getting to Susie Wiles and saying, this is what we agree to do, this is what we're agreeing to say, otherwise we're not coming. And Trump will adhere to that, believe it or not, because he wants the attention.
He wants the attention.
He wants the attention, and so he'll be willing to abide by that. And he's not going to embarrass his staff if the staff has been told, like, you know, can I tell this story? I know we're running out of time,
Please.
But you know, Carney wins the election. He doesn't call Trump. It's the first time in Canadian sovereign history where the Prime Minister of Canada doesn't call the sitting president. So this goes on for 3 or 4 weeks. Finally, Trump looks at Susie Wiles and says, hey, what the hell's going on? Why isn't he calling me? And Carney was doing this to him, right? Why is he not calling me? So then he talked to Susie. And he said, well, I'm not going to call him if he's going to call me the governor or the 51st state. So I will set up a call, but in the post-communique, I'm to be referred to as prime minister, and the country's got to be referred to as the sovereign country of Canada. And Trump agreed to it. And then they had the call. And so you have to make sure you're dealing with a reality star who wants drama, he wants tension, he wants acrimony, and you don't want to be a B player in that scene. You want to be a co-producer. Don't forget that.
This was an excellent tip. If we see the prime minister, we're going to let him know,
Yeah.
or whoever is prime minister after the
I
election.
saw him last night, but I didn't have enough time to tell him. Right?
Anthony, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the rest of the panel. Kari, Magnus, Robin, thanks so much.
Thanks again.
Great job, by the way. You did a great job. Great question.